January 1943. Dawn settles slowly over a prisoner of war camp in the American Southwest. The desert air is cold, sharper than anything the men inside the barbed wire have known in the Pacific. Watchtowers stand silent. Snow dusts the wooden barracks. Clinging to their roofs like ash. Inside one of those buildings, Japanese prisoners sit on narrow benches. Their uniforms are worn. Their faces are rigid, disciplined by habit rather than comfort. They expect roll call. They expect labor assignments. Perhaps interrogation. Instead, a U.S. Army guard enters carrying drafting boards. He sets them down carefully. Another follows with chalk. A third pens diagrams to the wall, simple mechanical sketches at first, gears, levers, measurements written in precise English numerals. No weapons. No threats. The room does not move. For men raised to believe capture was dishonor, this moment feels unreal. Education was never part of the script of defeat. Yet here it is, offered calmly, deliberately. Behind coils of American barbed wire, this quiet, bewildering scene was not an accident of kindness, but the product of a much larger war logic taking shape far beyond this camp. By the winter of 1943, the world was already deep inside the most expansive war in human history. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast buffer between continents, had become a continuous battlefield. Just 13 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States fully into the war. In the weeks that followed, Imperial Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, seizing Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies with speed and discipline, yet by mid-1942 the momentum began to slow. At Midway in June, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and much of its experienced naval aircrew. The strategic initiative gradually shifted. On Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, U.S. Marines encountered something unexpected: Japanese soldiers who, under extreme circumstances, surrendered rather than fight to the death. Many were wounded. Others were starving. All were conscious that they had crossed a powerful cultural boundary. For Imperial Japan, surrender was not merely a military failure. It was a personal and familial disgrace. Pre-war military doctrine, reinforced through training and propaganda, taught soldiers that death was preferable to capture. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors emphasized absolute loyalty and sacrifice. Prisoners of war, therefore, occupied an uncomfortable space in Japanese wartime ideology. They were not celebrated veterans. They were often erased. The Americans who captured them were aware of this psychological reality. Use intelligence. Officers studying Japanese behavior in the Pacific quickly realized that Japanese posts were fundamentally different from their German and Italian counterparts. They were fewer in number, deeply ashamed, and initially resistant to cooperation. Many refused to give their names or ranks. Some attempted suicide even after capture. By late 1942, however, the number of Japanese prisoners in American custody began to grow. Campaigns in the Solomons, New Guinea, and later the Aleutians added to the total. Transporting them across the Pacific posed logistical challenges. Holding them near combat zones risked rescue attempts and supply strain. The solution was relocation thousands of miles east. To the continental United States, between 1942 and 1945, Japanese prisoners were shipped by guarded transports to camps scattered across the American interior. They arrived in places whose names meant nothing to them: Arizona's desert flats, the forests of Wisconsin, the plains of Wyoming, the heat of Texas. These camps were often the same facilities that housed German and Italian posts, but Japanese prisoners were usually segregated. Both for security and cultural reasons, the U.S. War Department faced a complex question: how should these men be treated? International law offered a baseline. The 1929 Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate food, medical care, and protection from violence. But it said little about morale, ideology, or the psychological state of men raised to believe captivity itself was a form of death. American policy planners were pragmatic. They understood that mistreatment would invite retaliation against U.S. prisoners held by Japan, whose conditions were already known to be severe. They also recognized that idle prisoners bred unrest. Discipline alone would not be enough to maintain order in camps. Housing men trained for obedience but stripped of purpose. At the same time, the United States faced its own wartime pressures. Millions of American men were overseas. Farms, factories, and railroads were short of skilled labor. German and Italian posts were already being used extensively in agricultural and industrial work under Geneva guidelines. Japanese prisoners, though fewer and more closely watched, represented another potential workforce, but one burdened by cultural barriers and deep mistrust. It was within this environment of global war, ideological collision, and logistical necessity that American officials began to consider an unusual solution. Not punishment, not forced indoctrination, but structured discipline through routine, engagement through instruction, and control through education. The drafting boards that appeared in that barracks in January 1943 were the visible edge of a policy still forming, shaped by legal obligation, wartime efficiency, and a belief controversial even then that knowledge could be a stabilizing force inside prison camps. That belief would soon be tested. The framework that allowed those drafting boards to enter a prisoner barracks did not originate in that camp, or even in the Pacific War itself. It was rooted in a set of international assumptions forged after the devastation of the First World War, the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war established minimum standards for captivity food, shelter, medical care, and protection from abuse, but it also permitted something more flexible: the use of prisoner labor and the provision of intellectual and educational activities, so long as they were not coercive. For the United States, adherence to the Geneva Convention was not simply a legal obligation. It was strategic. American planners understood that the treatment of enemy prisoners was a message sent across oceans. Reports traveled. So did reprisals. By 1942, evidence of brutal conditions inside Japanese POW camps holding Allied soldiers was already filtering back through diplomatic channels and survivor accounts. The War Department was keenly aware that any mistreatment of Japanese prisoners could further endanger Americans held in Asia. Oversight of POW camps fell to the office of the Provost Marshal General. Under Major General Allen W. Goyen, the office developed detailed regulations governing daily life in the camps. These guidelines went far beyond confinement. They specified diet, medical inspections, recreation, religious observance, and critically, education. The philosophy was bluntly practical. Prisoners who were occupied were easier to manage, less likely to resist, and less prone to violence. Initially, educational programs were limited and cautious. Basic English instruction was offered, primarily to improve camp administration and reduce misunderstandings. Literacy classes were organized for prisoners who requested them. For German and Italian POWs, vocational training expanded quickly: mechanics, carpentry, electrical repair skills that could be used in labor. Detachments supporting the American war economy. Japanese prisoners presented a different challenge. Many were suspicious of instruction. Some refused to participate altogether, fearing that cooperation might be viewed as betrayal if they ever returned home. Camp commanders noted deep divisions within the Japanese prisoner population, between officers and enlisted men, between those willing to adapt and those clinging rigidly to pre-war ideology, yet necessity pressed forward. By 1943, labor shortages were acute, especially in agriculture and infrastructure maintenance. Japanese posts, though often physically weakened by months of jungle warfare and malnutrition, were disciplined, methodical, and accustomed to hierarchical instruction. American officers began to see potential where others saw only risk. Engineering and technical instruction did not begin as a grand re-education experiment. It emerged incrementally. A guard with pre-war drafting experience was assigned to teach basic mechanical drawing. An Army engineer, recovering from injury, was tasked with organizing simple maintenance workshops. Lessons were framed as practical, not ideological, measurements, materials, load limits. No political discussion. No lectures on democracy. Camp reports from 1943 and 1944 show careful language. Education was described as occupational training or technical familiarization. Attendance was officially voluntary, though social pressure within the camps often influenced participation. The Americans were careful not to violate Geneva restrictions against forced instruction. The Japanese prisoners, equally careful, observed before committing. What surprised many camp administrators was the response. Once initial resistance softened, attendance stabilized. Prisoners who had been engineers, machinists, or technicians in civilian life before conscription quietly stepped forward. Others learned from them. The classes became ordered, silent, focused. Not acts of defiance, but acts of survival. For American guards, the dynamic shifted as well. Teaching required patience. Authority was no longer enforced solely through rifles and regulations, but through credibility. Mutual respect limited, cautious, but real began to form in spaces that had once been defined only by wire and towers. By late 1944. Technical instruction inside some U.S. camps included basic civil engineering concepts, mechanical repair, tool use, and drafting fundamentals. These were not university courses. They were tightly controlled, closely monitored, and deliberately apolitical. But they marked a significant departure from traditional expectations of wartime. Imprisonment. What began as an administrative solution was becoming something more complex. A human experiment shaped by war, fear, and an unspoken recognition that the conflict would eventually end, and that men who survived it would have to live with what they had learned behind the wire. Those lessons would soon be examined from many angles. The first way to understand what unfolded inside these camps is through the human experience of the prisoners themselves. For many Japanese captives, the classroom was more unsettling than the battlefield. Combat allowed clarity, orders, enemies, survival. Education in captivity demanded something far more difficult: adaptation. To sit quietly while an enemy explained mechanical principles required setting aside years of conditioning. Shame did not disappear, but it was compartmentalized. Camp psychologists later noted that prisoners who engaged in structured learning displayed fewer signs of despair than those who withdrew completely. A second angle emerges from culture. Imperial Japanese military doctrine emphasized obedience, endurance, and sacrifice, but it also valued technical competence. Pre-war Japan had invested heavily in engineering education to support industrial expansion. This created a contradiction. Learning from Americans was humiliating, yet the subject matter itself, engineering, was familiar, even respected. Within weeks, some prisoners began quietly correcting diagrams or refining calculations. The guards noticed. Authority shifted subtly, from uniform to expertise. From the American perspective, the third angle was control. Camp commanders were not idealists. They were officers responsible for preventing riots, escapes, and violence. Education proved to be an effective stabilizer. Engineering classes created routine. Routine reduced tension. Reports from camps in Arizona and Texas documented fewer disciplinary incidents among prisoners enrolled in technical programs. The classroom became a space where hierarchy was maintained. Without constant enforcement, a fourth angle lies with the guards themselves. Many were reservists or older soldiers unfit for frontline duty. Teaching gave their assignment purpose. Some had been engineers, draftsmen, or mechanics before the war. Instructing prisoners forced them to see the enemy as individuals with abilities rather than abstractions. Officially, they maintained distance. Unofficially, respect sometimes formed quiet, professional, restrained. Together, these perspectives reveal a fragile equilibrium. Not friendship, not reconciliation, but a functioning system built on structure and mutual necessity. Yet beneath this balance ran deeper questions about technology, authority, and the moral boundaries of wartime education that would soon come into sharper focus. A fifth angle centers on technology itself. Engineering, by its nature, is neutral. A beam carries weight regardless of nationality. A gear turns according to physics, not ideology. This neutrality made technical instruction uniquely effective inside POW camps. Unlike political lectures or cultural exchange, engineering lessons did not demand belief-only attention. Prisoners could engage without feeling they had surrendered their identity. Camp records show that drafting accuracy, tool maintenance, and mechanical efficiency improved measurably in work detachments connected to these classes. Technology became a shared language spoken quietly across enemy lines. The sixth angle lies in leadership and institutional intent. While individual guards taught classes, the decision to allow technical education flowed from higher command. The Provost Marshal General's office approved curricula only after careful review. Blueprints were screened. Subjects were limited to civilian applications. No advanced military engineering. No weapons design. Camp commanders understood the risks of empowering prisoners with technical knowledge, yet they also understood the strategic horizon. The war would end. Japan would be devastated. A population stripped of infrastructure would need engineers more than soldiers. This was never stated openly, but internal memoranda suggest a long view, one shaped by post-war responsibility as much as wartime control. A seventh angle is moral, and it was debated even at the time. Critics within the U.S. military questioned whether educating enemy soldiers during wartime crossed an ethical line. Letters from civilian observers accused the government of leniency. Why, they asked, should men whose army had committed atrocities be taught useful skills while American families rationed at home? The official response was consistent. Education was permitted under international law, reduced camp unrest, and protected American posts abroad. Morality, in this context, was framed as obligation rather than forgiveness. Another angle emerges from the enemy's perspective, not the prisoners, but the Japanese state itself. Intelligence assessments suggested that returning POWs would face suspicion or silence. Many would not be celebrated. Some might be marginalized. Yet American officials understood that technical knowledge could survive even if public acknowledgement did not. Engineering skills did not require medals. They required only opportunity. In this way, education behind barbed wire quietly bypassed political hostility and embedded itself in the future workforce of a defeated nation. There was also a psychological angle that camp doctors and observers tracked closely. Prisoners engaged in technical instruction showed lower rates of self-harm and withdrawal. Learning restored a sense of agency. Even under captivity, the act of mastering a skill created forward motion. One medical report from 1944 described education as a stabilizing mental anchor in an otherwise suspended existence. The war had paused these men's lives. Engineering gave them a sense that time was still moving. Finally, there was an unspoken strategic angle. The United States was already planning for occupation. Civil affairs officers studied Germany and Japan simultaneously, anticipating the collapse of both regimes. Reconstruction would require labor, engineers, technicians, and administrators. While POW education was never officially labeled as preparation for occupation, it aligned seamlessly with those future needs. The camps became unintended laboratories for post-war policy-controlled environments where order, instruction, and compliance could be tested without public scrutiny. By 1944, these angles converged. What began as a modest effort to maintain discipline had become a structured system with measurable outcomes. Prisoners applied their training in camp workshops. Guards reported improved efficiency. Administrators noted declining incidents of unrest. The barbed wire still defined the perimeter, but inside it, something had shifted. The engineering classes no longer felt temporary. They felt institutional. And with that institutionalization came a decisive moment, one that would redefine the purpose of these programs and permanently alter the relationship between captor and captive. By mid-1944, the technical programs inside U.S. POW camps were no longer experimental. They had become a central feature of daily life. In Camp Papago Park, Arizona, records show that workshops were running 6 days a week. Japanese prisoners were assigned to drafting tables, metal shops, and woodworking stations. They produced functional items for the camp: furniture, simple mechanical devices, and tools for maintenance. Attendance was nearly universal. Refusal was rare, not out of coercion, but because prisoners recognized the utility in learning skills that could outlast captivity. One day, February 3, 1944, a group of prisoners successfully assembled a water pump previously deemed too complex for camp-level instruction. Guards and officers stood at the edge of the workshop, silent. For weeks, instructors had encouraged step-by-step calculation, patience, and precision. The prisoners executed the task flawlessly. The air, usually heavy with the quiet tension of enforced labor, was electric with muted astonishment both sides, acknowledging a moment of technical triumph. The significance of this achievement extended beyond mechanics. For the prisoners, mastery over a tool or diagram provided a sense of competence denied by defeat. Japanese soldiers, trained to surrender was a form of shame, now discovered that learning could reclaim dignity without violating imposed authority. For the American guards, the event validated a theory that patience and structure could produce results superior to brute enforcement. These moments were quietly documented in camp logs, skills demonstrated, morale improved, discipline maintained. In another camp near Fort Douglas, Utah, a different experiment unfolded. A small cohort of prisoners was taught basic civil engineering concepts, drafting simple bridges, understanding load distribution, and calculating material strengths. By May 1944, they were applying these lessons to the construction and repair of internal camp structures. Tents were reinforced, drainage improved, and workshops optimized. While none of these projects were strategically critical to the war effort, they were significant in psychological terms. The prisoners were no longer passive recipients of orders. They were contributors. Leadership played a crucial role in this turning point. Major General Allen W. Gullion and his staff emphasized careful oversight. They prohibited lessons that could be used for military production or weapons design. Instead, they focused on neutral engineering principles, civil, mechanical, and basic electrical work. The deliberate choice to confine instruction to non-combat applications ensured compliance with Geneva regulations while still fostering skill development. This balance between opportunity and restriction became the defining characteristic of the camp. Programs. By late summer 1944, observers began noting subtle behavioral shifts. Prisoners who had once sat in the corners, refusing to engage, now arrived early for classes. The mood in workshops was quiet but focused. Whispered exchanges in Japanese revealed collaboration and problem-solving. Reports from the camps described prisoners mentoring one another, passing techniques learned from previous instructors, creating a microeconomy of knowledge, entirely self-sustaining within the wire. This period also marked a crucial cultural breach. Imperial doctrine had taught these men that surrender and captivity were dishonorable. Yet here they were, learning from the enemy, applying knowledge with meticulous care, and achieving success in tasks that demanded intelligence, precision, and foresight. Discipline had not vanished, but it had transformed from rigid obedience to engaged responsibility. By autumn 1944, the cumulative effect of these programs could be measured in more than morale. Camp efficiency, tool maintenance, and internal construction had all improved noticeably. American guards, once skeptical, began to recognize the transformative potential of instruction. In essence, the turning point was not a single moment, but a sustained realization. Education, even behind barbed wire, could produce cooperation and human achievement where fear and punishment alone had failed. And yet, as 1945 approached, the war itself was shifting toward its conclusion. Japanese prisoners, now skilled in practical engineering and familiar with the routines of instruction, faced the looming reality of repatriation. What they had learned would follow them beyond the fences, into a world they had fought to defend, and into a society that had been entirely reshaped by conflict. Early 1945 marked the peak of the engineering programs. In Camp Papago Park, a small group of prisoners had been assigned to a project that would test the limits of their training: the construction of a functional water filtration system for the camp. The design was not military. It was purely practical. Yet the stakes were higher than any previous assignment. Guards monitored every calculation, every connection, aware that success or failure would reveal the real potential of these programs. By February, the prisoners had not only completed the system, they had improved upon the original plans. A series of adjustments to pipe angles and water pressure demonstrated understanding beyond rote instruction. Guards and officers watched silently, noting with understated astonishment the prisoners' precision, ingenuity, and efficiency. One camp report stated, technical knowledge applied effectively, discipline maintained without coercion, morale visibly improved. These words, brief and clinical, concealed the profound implications of the event. Men who were taught could learn, and in learning, could reclaim a fragment of autonomy and self-respect. The program expanded to other camps across the United States. At Fort Douglas, Utah, Japanese prisoners began designing small-scale workshops to improve internal logistics. In Wisconsin, prisoners drafted and built storage systems for camp supplies. In each case, American instructors emphasized safety, standards, and the application of mathematics and engineering principles. Camp administrators noticed that prisoners who had previously resisted all forms of engagement now sought participation, understanding that their work was valued, even if only within the confines of the camp. The psychological transformation was striking. Prisoners who had arrived sullen and withdrawn were now teaching their peers. Hierarchies based solely on rank were supplemented by technical proficiency. An enlisted man with pre-war carpentry experience could gain authority over officers in the workshop setting. This subtle shift, though unnoticed by most casual observers, represented a profound reordering of status and morale behind the wire. Meanwhile, news from the Pacific reminded everyone that the war was reaching its final phase. Iwo Jima fell in March 1945. Okinawa followed in June. The Japanese military's capacity for offensive operations was collapsing. For the prisoners, the knowledge they had gained now carried a different weight. Engineering was no longer a temporary distraction. It was preparation for life after repatriation, for survival in a homeland devastated by bombings and occupation. For the Americans, it was a confirmation of a hypothesis, that practical education could humanize the enemy without compromising security. By summer 1945, the turning point was complete. The Japanese prisoners had become active participants in the administration and maintenance of the camps. Their technical contributions improved living conditions, streamlined labor, and even inspired minor innovations. The dynamic between captor and captive had shifted from rigid enforcement to a complex, interdependent system of instruction and compliance. Then came August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's surrender, and the end of the Pacific War fundamentally altered the context in which these programs had operated. The barbed wire would soon fall, but the lessons endured. Prisoners were no longer merely captives, they were technicians, draftsmen, engineers in miniature, capable of applying what they had learned beyond the camp walls. Their experience illustrated a rare wartime truth: knowledge, even when offered under duress, could survive ideology and conflict, becoming a bridge between enemies rather than a weapon against them. This transformation, the human, cultural, technical, and moral culmination, set the stage for the aftermath. How these men reintegrated what they carried back to Japan, and how the United States assessed the success of this unprecedented approach would define the final chapters of this story. August 15, 1945, is etched into history as the day Japan announced its surrender. Across the Pacific, in ports, camps, and barracks, the reality of war's end rippled outward. For Japanese prisoners in U.S. custody, the announcement brought a mix of relief, apprehension, and confusion. Many had survived years of combat, jungle disease, and the psychological torment of capture, only to face a homeland shattered by atomic strikes, conventional bombings, and the collapse of the imperial system they had served. Repatriation began almost immediately. Ships transported prisoners from camps in Arizona, Utah, Texas, and Wisconsin back across the Pacific. Official logs show that by late 1945, the majority had returned to Japan. though some remained temporarily for labor and administrative processing. For these men, the knowledge acquired behind barbed wire traveled with them, quietly stored in memory and skill. Technical training from drafting and mechanical maintenance to civil engineering concepts was no longer a theoretical exercise. It became a tangible asset they carried home. U.S. Army assessments of the program highlighted measurable outcomes. Camp reports recorded reduced incidents of violence, improved workshop efficiency, and increased prisoner morale. Guards wrote in internal memos that the engineering and vocational programs had achieved more than simple occupational distraction. They had cultivated engagement, cooperation, and responsibility. The military acknowledged that Japanese posts had learned skills that could be applied immediately, whether in reconstruction work within Japan or in post-war industry. These reports noted cautiously that while the program had succeeded in practical terms, its long-term social and psychological effects were impossible to quantify at the time. On the human side, experiences varied. Some prisoners returned to devastated towns and cities, where engineering skills could be applied in rebuilding homes, bridges, and utilities. Others found themselves in rural regions where infrastructure was a patchwork of destroyed facilities. In letters and memoirs written decades later, former posts recalled the quiet dignity that technical education had afforded them. Learning became a lifeline, a rare space in which they could reclaim agency without violating the strictures of honor imposed by their military upbringing. The classroom, in retrospect, was a paradoxical site of liberation inside captivity. At the same time, the United States faced its own post-war calculations. Officials reviewed the lessons of POW management not only for future conflicts but also for peacetime policy. The engineering and vocational programs offered a model for structured prisoner engagement that balanced security, productivity, and humane treatment. The War Department highlighted that, despite fears of ideological contamination or misuse of skills, no significant incidents occurred in which technical instruction led to sabotage or escape. This outcome reinforced the belief that education, carefully administered, could be a stabilizing force in containment scenarios. Cultural tensions persisted, however. Some American observers remained skeptical, questioning the morality of teaching the enemy skills that could, theoretically, be used against the United States in the future. Yet the pragmatism of the approach limited to civilian applications, closely monitored and embedded in routine discipline, minimized such risks. Prisoners returned home with knowledge valuable for survival and reconstruction, but not for renewed military aggression. The combination of practical skill, psychological stability, and moral ambiguity defined the immediate aftermath of the program. Japanese posts were no longer mere captives. They were survivors and apprentices of a system that had treated them as human beings capable of growth. Their experience foreshadowed a new post-war reality: reconstruction, education, and the integration of technical knowledge into the rebuilding of a defeated nation. The story of these programs did not end with repatriation. It extended into the broader social and technological reconstruction of Japan, into U.S.-Japan relations, and into the philosophy of wartime management itself.